The encounter. The sky above was a dull gray, the kind that made even the most vibrant landscapes look lifeless. The air smelled of ash and metal. Lieutenant Ryan Carter adjusted the straps of his worn-out backpack, scanning the desolate alien ruins around him. He had been walking for hours, his legs aching with every step. The war was over, or so the generals claimed, but the battlefield didn't seem to know that. The ruins were eerily quiet, except for the occasional crackle of a distant fire or the groaning collapse of a building. Broken towers reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and alien vehicles lay scattered, half buried in rubble. Ryan hated this place. He hated the war. Most of all, he hated how he was still stuck here, left behind to scavenge supplies while the rest of his unit had pulled out. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he thought he imagined it at first. A voice, weak and trembling, carried by the wind. Ryan froze, his hand instinctively gripping his rifle. He listened. "Help. Me." The voice was strange, almost musical, but filled with pain. Ryan scanned the area, his heart pounding. He didn't trust it. Could be a trap. Alien tech was tricky. Maybe some automated lure meant to draw him out. But something about the voice felt real. Cautiously, Ryan followed the sound, his boots crunching softly on the cracked ground. He moved through the wreckage, his eyes darting to every shadow. The voice grew louder, more desperate. Finally, he saw her. She was lying among the rubble, her body half covered by debris. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale blue with delicate patterns that seemed to glow in the dim light. She wasn't just any alien. The intricate armor she wore, now dented and scorched, marked her as someone important. And the small glowing crest on her forehead. Ryan had seen it before in briefing files. It was the mark of Xerian royalty. The alien woman, Princess Valera, if he remembered correctly, looked up at him with wide, glassy eyes. Her face was streaked with blood, and her breaths were shallow. She tried to move but winced in pain. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't leave me." Ryan stared at her, unsure what to do. This wasn't his fight. The Xerians had been humanity's enemies just weeks ago, and yet here she was, helpless, abandoned, left to die like so many others in this cursed war. "Why should I help you?" he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he was asking her or himself. Valera's eyes flickered with something. Fear, desperation, or maybe a faint spark of hope. "They betrayed me," she managed to say, her words slow and broken. "I was left here, to die." Ryan clenched his jaw. He didn't have time for this. Every moment he stayed increased the risk of being found by scavengers or patrol drones. But as he looked at her, something inside him twisted. She wasn't just an enemy anymore. She was a living being, abandoned and suffering, just like so many others he had seen during this endless war. With a frustrated sigh, Ryan slung his rifle over his shoulder and knelt beside her. "All right," he said gruffly, "but if this is some kind of trick, I swear." "No trick," Valera murmured, her voice fading. Ryan carefully began to remove the debris covering her. Her body was lighter than he expected, almost fragile. She groaned in pain as he lifted her, but she didn't resist. Her injuries were bad. Burns, cuts, and what looked like a deep gash on her side. He didn't have much to treat her with, just a small medkit in his pack. "Hold on," he said, his tone softer now. "I'll patch you up as best as I can, but we need to move. This place isn't safe." Valera nodded weakly, closing her eyes. Ryan worked quickly, applying a makeshift bandage to her side and giving her a small dose of painkillers. It wasn't much, but it would keep her alive. For now. As he finished, a faint mechanical whirring reached his ears. Ryan froze. He knew that sound. Patrol drones. The enemy was close. "Damn it," he muttered, glancing around. They couldn't stay here. If the drones found them, they were both dead. He hoisted Valera onto his back, her weight pressing down on his already tired frame. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. She didn't reply, but he could feel her faint breaths against his shoulder. Moving as quickly and quietly as he could, Ryan slipped into the shadows of the ruins. The whirring grew louder, the sound of the drones cutting through the stillness. Ryan's heart raced. One wrong move, one misplaced step, and they'd be caught. As he ducked behind a collapsed wall, a drone passed overhead, its spotlight sweeping the ground. Ryan held his breath, his fingers tightening around the straps of his pack. He glanced at Valera. Her eyes were closed, her face pale. The drone hovered for a moment, then moved on. Ryan exhaled slowly, his body tense with adrenaline. They weren't safe yet, but they had a chance. For now, that was enough. "You better be worth this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Valera's lips moved faintly, though he couldn't make out the words. As he carried her deeper into the ruins, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something far bigger than himself. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he'd make it out alive. A fragile alliance. Ryan trudged through the ruins, his legs screaming in protest with every step. Princess Valera's slight frame wasn't heavy, but the weight of responsibility pressed on him like a boulder. He didn't know how long they had before the patrol drones returned, or worse, before ground troops started sweeping the area. The ruins were a maze of broken walls and jagged metal, offering plenty of places to hide, but just as many opportunities to get cornered. Ryan's grip on his rifle tightened as his eyes scanned every shadow. His instincts told him this wasn't just a random search. Someone was hunting her. "You need to wake up," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder at Valera's pale face. She looked more fragile now, her shimmering blue skin dulled and marred by injuries. He wasn't sure how much longer she could last without proper medical care. As if hearing him, Valera stirred slightly, her head tilting against his shoulder. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Ryan hesitated. It was a question he had been asking himself since he decided to save her. He could have walked away, left her to die like her own people had. But something about the desperation in her voice had struck a chord he didn't want to admit existed. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe I'm just tired of seeing people get left behind." Valera's eyes fluttered open, her gaze weak but piercing. Humans, always meddling, always thinking they can save the universe. Ryan smirked faintly. And Xarians always thinking they're better than everyone else. Guess we're both stubborn. She didn't reply, her eyelids drooping again. Ryan shifted her weight slightly, feeling the tension in her body relax. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least she wasn't arguing anymore. After what felt like an eternity, Ryan found a relatively safe spot, a collapsed building with a partially intact basement. The entrance was concealed by rubble, and the thick walls would offer some protection from scanners. He slipped inside, setting Valera down gently on the cold, dusty floor. "Stay awake," he ordered, rummaging through his pack. "I need to check your wounds." Valera let out a weak laugh that sounded more like a cough. "You give orders like a soldier." "That's because I am one," Ryan replied, pulling out his medkit. "Now hold still." He worked quickly, peeling away the makeshift bandage on her side. The wound was deep, and the alien physiology didn't make things any easier. Her blood was a strange silvery color, and the tissue around the gash seemed to shimmer faintly, as if it were trying to heal itself. "This isn't good," Ryan muttered. He cleaned the wound as best as he could, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Valera winced but didn't cry out. "You're not like the others," she said after a moment, her voice softer now. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Others? The humans we fought in the war," she explained. "They were cold, ruthless, efficient." Ryan snorted. "War does that to people, makes them forget what it means to be human. And yet, here you are, risking your life for someone who tried to kill your kind." Ryan paused, looking at her. Her words carried a strange mix of accusation and admiration, and he wasn't sure how to respond. Finally, he said, "Not all of us are monsters. Just like not all of you are." Valera studied him for a moment, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly. Then she said something that caught him off guard. "I never wanted this war. My father did. He believed humans were a threat to our empire. I thought he was wrong." Ryan frowned, leaning back on his heels. "You're telling me you didn't agree with your people invading human colonies?" Valera shook her head weakly. "I thought we could coexist. But the council, they said peace was a weakness, that humans would destroy us if we didn't strike first." Ryan didn't know whether to believe her, but there was a sincerity in her voice that was hard to ignore. He sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. "Great. So you're telling me this whole war was started because a bunch of politicians got scared of what might happen?" Valera gave a faint nod. "And now, they've turned on me. I was the only one who spoke out against the council. They saw me as a threat." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "So you got betrayed by your own people. Guess we got more in common than I thought." The sound of distant footsteps snapped him back to reality. He froze, holding up a hand to silence Valera. She tensed, her eyes darting toward the entrance. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, accompanied by the faint hum of energy weapons. "Stay here," Ryan whispered, grabbing his rifle. Before Valera could protest, he slipped out of the basement, pressing himself against the wall. His heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder. Peering around the corner, he saw 3 figures. Xarian soldiers, their armor gleaming even in the dim light. They were searching the area, their weapons at the ready. Ryan gritted his teeth. He couldn't take them all head-on, not with the limited ammo he had left. But he also couldn't let them find Valera. She was his responsibility now, whether he liked it or not. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small device, a crude but effective noisemaker he had cobbled together during the war. He activated it and tossed it into a nearby alley. The device let out a sharp, high-pitched screech, causing the soldiers to whip around. They moved cautiously toward the noise, their weapons raised. Ryan waited until they were far enough away, then slipped back into the basement. "We need to move," he said, helping Valera to her feet. She nodded weakly, leaning against him for support. "You could have left me," she murmured. Ryan gave her a small, grim smile. "Yeah, but where's the fun in that?" As they disappeared deeper into the ruins, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that this fragile alliance was going to get a lot more complicated. "The chase begins." Ryan's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he pushed through the narrow alleyways of the ruined city. The shadows stretched long in the fading twilight, but he didn't dare slow down. Valera clung weakly to his shoulder, her steps uneven as she tried to keep pace. Behind them, the sound of footsteps and mechanical drones echoed louder with each passing second. The hunters were closing in. "Stay quiet," Ryan whispered over his shoulder, glancing at her pale face. Her shimmering skin had lost much of its glow, and her breaths were shallow. She wasn't going to last long at this pace. Valera's voice was barely audible. "Why do they not stop?" Ryan tightened his grip on his rifle as they turned a corner, ducking behind a crumbled wall. He crouched, his eyes scanning the open street ahead. "They want you alive," he said flatly, "or dead enough to not be a problem." Valera leaned against the wall, her fingers clutching her injured side. "My people are thorough. They will not stop until—" "Yeah, I got that," Ryan interrupted, cutting her off. "You can give me the motivational speech later. Right now, we've got bigger problems." The distant hum of drone engines grew louder. Ryan cursed under his breath and scanned the area for cover. A toppled alien transport vehicle lay nearby, its massive frame half buried in rubble. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Move," he urged, pulling Valera with him. They slipped into the shadows of the vehicle just as a patrol drone floated into view. Its spotlight swept across the street, illuminating the debris with cold precision. Ryan held his breath, his grip tightening on his rifle. He could feel Valera trembling beside him. The drone hovered for a moment, its mechanical eye scanning the area. Then, with a low hum, it moved on, disappearing around a corner. Ryan exhaled slowly. That was too close, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Valera slumped against the vehicle, her eyes fluttering closed. "I cannot go much further," she whispered. Ryan crouched in front of her, shaking his head. "We don't have a choice. They'll find us if we stop." She looked at him, her gaze heavy with exhaustion. "You should leave me. Save yourself." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, not happening. I didn't drag you this far just to call it quits now." Valera's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Stubborn human. Before Ryan could reply, the sound of voices reached his ears. He froze, motioning for Valera to stay quiet. The voices were guttural and sharp, the language unfamiliar but unmistakably Xarian. Ryan peered around the edge of the vehicle. 3 Xarian soldiers were moving down the street, their weapons glowing faintly in the dim light. One of them held a scanning device, its screen pulsing with a red dot. "They're tracking us," Ryan whispered, his stomach sinking. Valera's eyes flickered open, her expression grim. "They are using my energy signature." The crest. She touched the faintly glowing symbol on her forehead. "It makes me easy to find." "Great," Ryan muttered. "So we're basically running with a beacon on our heads." He glanced around, his mind racing. He needed a plan, something to buy them time or throw the hunters off their trail. His eyes landed on the rubble nearby, an idea forming in his mind. "Stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Valera started to protest, but he was already moving. Keeping low, he crept toward the pile of rubble, careful not to make a sound. His fingers found what he was looking for, a small piece of metal, jagged and sharp. He pulled it free, his gaze darting back to the approaching soldiers. Ryan rigged the metal to his noisemaker, setting the device to emit a high-frequency pulse. It wasn't much, but it might confuse their scanners long enough for him and Valera to escape. He activated the device and hurled it into a nearby alley. The sharp, piercing sound echoed through the ruins, drawing the attention of the soldiers. The Xarians paused, their weapons raised. The one with the scanner barked an order, and the group moved toward the alley, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Ryan didn't wait to see what happened next. He hurried back to Valera, grabbing her arm. "Let's go." She stumbled as he pulled her to her feet, her movements sluggish. "You are insane," she murmured. "Yeah, well, it's working so far," Ryan shot back, leading her away from the noise. They moved quickly, weaving through the ruins. The noisemaker had bought them time, but Ryan knew it wouldn't last. The Xarians were too smart to fall for the trick for long. As they rounded another corner, they came to a wide-open plaza. The ground was littered with debris, and a massive fountain stood at the center, its once majestic structure now cracked and dry. Ryan stopped, his eyes scanning the area. It was too open, too exposed. But before he could find another route, the hum of drones filled the air again. "Damn it," he muttered. The drone appeared above the plaza, its spotlight sweeping across the ground. Ryan pulled Valera into the shadows of the fountain, his heart pounding. The drone hovered for a moment, its mechanical eye locking onto something. Then it emitted a sharp, piercing sound, an alarm that echoed through the ruins. Ryan's stomach dropped. They had been spotted. "Run," he shouted, pulling Valera with him. The drone's spotlight followed them as they sprinted across the plaza. Behind them, the sound of footsteps and shouts grew louder. The hunters were closing in. Ryan's mind raced. He needed a way out, something to slow them down. His eyes landed on a crumbling building ahead, its structure leaning precariously. "This way," he called, dragging Valera toward the building. As they reached the entrance, Ryan fired a shot at the support beams. The structure groaned, the sound of cracking stone filling the air. "Keep going," he shouted, pushing Valera ahead. The building collapsed behind them, a cloud of dust and debris swallowing their pursuers. Ryan didn't stop to see if it had worked. He kept moving, his grip on Valera's arm firm. When they finally stopped, both of them were gasping for air. Ryan leaned against a wall, his chest heaving. Valera sank to the ground, her face pale but determined. "They will not stop," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "You know this." Ryan nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah, but neither will I." For the first time, Valera's lips curved into a faint smile. "Perhaps humans are not so weak after all." Ryan chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "Don't get used to it, Princess. We're just getting started." The chase wasn't over, but for now, they had survived. And that was enough. Secrets of the Tsarian Empire. The makeshift shelter was a broken chamber buried deep beneath the ruins of a fallen Tsarian monument. Its walls were lined with strange glowing crystals that pulsed faintly, casting an otherworldly light across the room. Ryan leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath, his rifle resting against his knee. Across from him, Valera sat slumped against the cold stone, her wounds hastily bandaged but far from healed. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the occasional distant rumble of collapsing structures above. Ryan's mind was racing, trying to piece together a plan. They couldn't keep running forever. "You're quiet," he finally said, his voice low. Valera glanced up, her glowing eyes meeting his. Her face was pale, the shimmer in her skin dimming further with each passing hour. "I was thinking." "That's never good," Ryan replied, his tone dry. "Care to share with the class?" Valera hesitated, her hands resting on her knees. "You asked before why they are hunting me so relentlessly." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "The answer is complicated." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "I'm all ears. We've got nothing but time down here." Valera exhaled softly, her gaze distant. The Tsarian Empire was not always as you see it now. We were once explorers, seekers of knowledge. My ancestors believed in unity, in understanding other species, even those like yours. Her lips twisted into a faint, bitter smile. But power has a way of corrupting even the noblest ideals. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let me guess, someone decided unity wasn't profitable enough." Her expression hardened. "The Council. They saw humanity's rapid advancement as a threat. Your kind was unpredictable, dangerous. They convinced my father that war was the only option. They claimed it was for the survival of our species. But in truth," she trailed off, her hands clenching into fists. "In truth, they just wanted more power." Ryan finished for her, his tone grim. Valera nodded. "They developed a weapon, one that could tip the scales of any conflict. The erythium core. A device capable of collapsing the very fabric of space-time around an entire planet." Ryan's blood ran cold. "A planet killer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm guessing it's not just a myth." "It is real," Valera said, her tone heavy with regret. "And it is why they turned on me. I opposed its creation, argued that such a weapon would not ensure our survival, but guarantee our destruction. The Council branded me a traitor, claiming I sought to weaken our empire. Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly recovered. "They used it as an excuse to overthrow my father and seize control." Ryan stared at her, his mind reeling. "And now they have it," he said, piecing the puzzle together. "That's why they're after you. They're afraid you'll stop them." Valera met his gaze, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "I am the only one who knows how to disable the core. If they eliminate me, no one will stand in their way." Ryan leaned back against the wall, running a hand through his hair. Well, that's just great, he muttered. So not only am I babysitting an alien princess, but I'm also caught in the middle of a galactic arms race. You could leave, Valera said quietly. You owe me nothing. It would be understandable. Ryan snorted. Yeah, and what? Let them destroy Earth next. Sorry, princess, but I've got a problem with letting genocidal maniacs play God. For a moment, there was silence. Then Valera smiled faintly, the gesture small but genuine. Perhaps I was wrong about humans, she said softly. Perhaps there is more to your kind than I realized. Ryan shrugged, trying to ignore the strange warmth her words stirred in him. We're not all bad, he said. Now let's focus on staying alive long enough to make your fancy weapon useless. The quiet didn't last long. A faint, rhythmic thudding sound began to echo through the tunnels, growing louder with each passing second. Ryan tensed, grabbing his rifle and motioning for Valera to stay still. What is it? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Trouble, Ryan replied, his eyes narrowing. He moved toward the entrance of the chamber, pressing his back against the wall. The thudding grew louder, accompanied by faint voices speaking in Syrian. Ryan's grip on his rifle tightened. They're here, Valera murmured, her voice tinged with fear. Ryan nodded. And they're not leaving without a fight. He glanced around the room, his mind racing. The chamber had no other exits, and the only cover was the scattered debris along the walls. They were cornered. Valera shifted slightly, wincing as she tried to stand. I can. No, Ryan cut her off sharply. You're in no shape to fight. Let me handle this. She hesitated, her pride clearly warring with her sense of reason. Finally, she nodded, sinking back against the wall. Ryan took a deep breath, steadying himself. The first soldier appeared at the entrance, his weapon glowing faintly in the dim light. Ryan didn't wait for him to fully enter. He fired a single, precise shot, the soldier collapsing with a grunt. The others reacted instantly, shouting orders in their guttural language. A barrage of energy blasts lit up the chamber, forcing Ryan to duck behind a large piece of debris. He fired back, his shots calculated and deliberate. Ryan. Valera's voice cut through the chaos. They won't stop. You must. Not now, princess, he shouted, gritting his teeth as another blast narrowly missed his head. The fight was brutal, the confined space amplifying every sound and making every movement a gamble. But Ryan's years of training paid off. He used the terrain to his advantage, picking off the soldiers one by one until the chamber fell silent once more. Breathing heavily, he turned back to Valera. You okay? He asked, his voice rough. She nodded, her expression a mix of relief and something else, something he couldn't quite place. You? Fought well. Ryan smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. Yeah, well, I've had practice. As the adrenaline began to fade, the weight of their situation settled over them once more. The Xarians knew where they were now, and it was only a matter of time before more soldiers arrived. We can't stay here, Ryan said, his tone serious. We need to find that weapon and shut it down. Valera met his gaze, her expression resolute. Then we go. Together. Ryan nodded, a small part of him impressed by her determination. Together, he agreed. The chase wasn't over, and the stakes were higher than ever. But for the first time, Ryan felt a spark of hope. They had a chance, however slim, to stop the Xarians and save not just themselves, but perhaps countless others as well. The ambush. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, their winding paths illuminated by faint bioluminescent veins running through the walls. Ryan led the way, his rifle raised, every nerve in his body on edge. Valera followed closely, leaning against the wall for support. Her breathing was labored, and her glowing skin had dulled further, but her eyes remained sharp and determined. They were getting closer to something important. Ryan could feel it in the air, a strange tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. How much farther? Ryan asked, his voice low. Valera paused, closing her eyes for a moment as if listening to something he couldn't hear. The core is less than a mile from here, but there will be more soldiers, elite ones. Ryan glanced back at her, his brow furrowing. Elite. As in, tougher than the guys who almost turned me into a pile of ash back there. Valera nodded, her expression grim. The Tsarian Shadow Guard. They are not like the scouts you faced. They are relentless, and they will not hesitate to kill both of us. Ryan gritted his teeth. Great, just what I needed, a bunch of super soldiers gunning for us. Got any bright ideas, Princess? Valera hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the floor. I may be able to help, but it will cost me. Ryan stopped, turning to face her fully. What do you mean, cost you? She straightened, though it was clear the effort took everything she had. My energy, the same energy they are using to track me. I can release it in a focused burst, but it will weaken me further. Possibly, permanently. Ryan's jaw tightened. And you didn't think to mention this sooner. I did not think you would care, she replied, her voice steady, but tinged with a faint bitterness. You are human. Your kind sees us as enemies. Ryan stared at her for a moment, then sighed. Yeah, well, maybe I'm not like the rest of my kind. Let's keep that in our back pocket for now. If we're going to get out of this alive, I'll need you at full strength. Valera's eyes softened, but she said nothing. She simply nodded and followed as Ryan turned back toward the path ahead. They were close to the core's chamber when Ryan's instincts screamed at him to stop. He held up a hand, signaling for Valera to stay back. The air had changed. There was a faint, metallic tang that reminded him of the moment before an energy weapon discharge. Trap, he whispered, scanning the area. The tunnel opened into a wide cavern, its walls lined with glowing blue veins that pulsed like a heartbeat. At the center stood a massive alien structure, a series of concentric rings hovering above a pedestal, rotating slowly. The Erythium core. Is that it? Ryan asked, his voice barely audible. Valera nodded, her eyes fixed on the device. Yes, we must disable it quickly. If they activate it. Before she could finish, a low guttural voice echoed through the cavern. You will not touch the core, traitor. Ryan spun around, his rifle raised. A group of Tsarian soldiers emerged from the shadows, their armor sleeker and darker than the ones he had fought before, the Shadow Guard. Their leader, a towering figure with glowing red eyes and a jagged energy blade, stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Valera. You should have accepted your fate, Princess, the leader growled. Now you will die with your human pet. Ryan smirked, though his grip on his rifle tightened. Pet? That's a little harsh. I prefer annoying thorn in your side. The leader snarled, raising his blade. Kill them. The cavern erupted into chaos. Ryan dove behind a pillar as the first volley of energy blasts tore through the air. His heart pounded as he peeked out, firing a few shots at the advancing soldiers. They moved with terrifying precision, their every step calculated. One of them fired at his cover, the blast sending chunks of stone flying. Valera, he shouted, ducking as another blast narrowly missed him. A little help here. Valera was already moving, her hands glowing faintly as she summoned a burst of energy. The blast struck one of the Shadow Guard, sending him flying into the wall. But the effort left her staggering, her breath coming in sharp gasps. I cannot keep this up, she said, clutching her side. Ryan gritted his teeth. Then don't. Just stay alive. I'll handle the rest. He darted from cover, firing in rapid succession. The Shadow Guard were faster than he anticipated, dodging his shots with inhuman agility. One of them lunged at him, an energy blade slicing through the air. Ryan barely managed to block with the butt of his rifle, the force of the impact sending him sprawling. The soldier loomed over him, raising the blade for a killing blow. Ryan acted on instinct, pulling a small explosive charge from his belt and slamming it against the soldier's chest. He rolled away as the charge detonated, the explosion engulfing his attacker in a blinding flash. "Ryan," Valera's voice cut through the chaos. He turned to see the leader of the Shadow Guard closing in on her, his blade crackling with energy. Valera tried to summon another burst of power, but her body gave out, and she collapsed to her knees. Ryan didn't think. He sprinted toward her, firing his rifle until the clip ran dry. The leader deflected the shots with his blade, his movements impossibly fast. Ryan reached Valera just as the blade came down, raising his rifle to block. The weapon shattered under the force, the impact sending Ryan crashing to the ground. The leader sneered, his blade hovering over Ryan's throat. "Foolish human," he growled. "You should have stayed out of this." Ryan's hand found a shard of broken stone, and with a desperate roar, he drove it into the leader's unarmored side. The Xarian howled in pain, staggering back. Ryan scrambled to his feet, grabbing Valera and pulling her behind a pillar. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight. Valera nodded weakly, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved me." "Yeah, well, don't get used to it," Ryan said, reloading his rifle. "This isn't over." The leader was already recovering, his red eyes blazing with fury. The remaining Shadow Guard regrouped, their weapons trained on Ryan and Valera. "We need a miracle," Ryan muttered, his mind racing. Valera's hand touched his arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "No," she said, her voice steady. "We need to fight, together." Ryan looked at her, his resolve hardening. "All right, Princess. Let's give them hell." As the Shadow Guard closed in, Ryan and Valera stood side by side, their unlikely alliance stronger than ever. The odds were against them, but neither of them was ready to give up. Not yet. A last stand. The cavern trembled with the hum of the erythium core, its rotating rings spinning faster as if the weapon could sense the impending battle. Ryan tightened his grip on his rifle, standing shoulder to shoulder with Valera. The Shadow Guard loomed ahead, their weapons glowing menacingly in the dim light. "You sure about this?" Ryan asked, sparing a glance at Valera. Her breathing was labored, and her glow had faded to a faint shimmer, but her eyes burned with defiance. "I was born for moments like this," she replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "We fight. We survive." Ryan gave her a tight nod. "All right then. Let's make it count." The leader of the Shadow Guard stepped forward, his crimson blade sparking with energy. His voice echoed through the chamber, cold and commanding. "Surrender, and your deaths will be quick. Resist, and you will know pain beyond imagining." Ryan smirked, raising his rifle. "Yeah, I think we'll take our chances." The leader's eyes narrowed, and with a sharp gesture, he signaled the attack. The Shadow Guard advanced in unison, their movements eerily synchronized. The battle erupted in a flurry of chaos. Ryan fired the first shot, the recoil jolting against his shoulder. His aim was true, striking one of the guards in the chest. The soldier stumbled but didn't fall, his armor absorbing the worst of the impact. Ryan cursed under his breath, diving behind a pillar as energy blasts filled the air. Valera raised her hands, summoning a burst of shimmering energy. The wave rippled outward, colliding with the nearest guards and sending them sprawling. The effort left her visibly weakened, but she didn't falter. "Focus on the leader," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "He controls the others." Ryan glanced toward the leader, who was advancing slowly, his blade crackling with deadly intent. "Easier said than done, Princess," he called back, ducking as a blast scorched the pillar beside him. The Shadow Guard moved like predators, their attacks relentless. Ryan fired off another volley, managing to take down one of the soldiers with a lucky shot to the neck joint. The remaining guards pressed forward, their weapons forcing him to retreat further into the chamber. Valera unleashed another pulse of energy, the light from her attack illuminating the cavern. It struck the leader directly, but he barely flinched, his armor glowing faintly as it absorbed the blast. "You are weak, traitor," the leader sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your power is nothing compared to the core." Ryan's jaw tightened. He fired at the leader, but the Xerian deflected the shots with his blade, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Ryan barely managed to block the first swing, the energy blade slicing through the barrel of his rifle. "Damn it!" he shouted, throwing the ruined weapon aside. He ducked under the next attack, grabbing a piece of jagged metal from the ground. The improvised weapon was a poor substitute, but it was better than nothing. The fight became a blur of movement and desperation. Ryan dodged and parried as the leader's blade came at him with deadly precision. Sparks flew as the metal shard clashed against the energy weapon, the impact sending jolts up Ryan's arm. He was outmatched, and he knew it. "Valera," he called out, his voice strained. Any time now would be great. Valera staggered to her feet, her hands glowing faintly. She raised them toward the core, her focus intense. The air around her began to shimmer, and the weapon's rings slowed slightly, as if responding to her power. The leader's eyes widened in fury. "No," he roared, abandoning Ryan to charge at Valera. Ryan didn't hesitate. He threw himself at the Xerian, tackling him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of both of them, but Ryan didn't let up. He punched the leader's helmet, the force jarring his knuckles, but leaving a dent in the alien armor. The leader snarled, throwing Ryan off with a surge of strength. "You are nothing," he bellowed, rising to his feet. Ryan wiped blood from his mouth, his chest heaving. "Maybe," he said, his voice low. "But I'm not the one who's scared." The leader hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Valera to act. With a cry of determination, she unleashed a concentrated blast of energy, striking the core directly. The rings shuddered violently, their glow flickering. The leader turned toward her, his rage palpable. "You will die for this," he roared, charging at her with his blade raised. Ryan moved without thinking. He lunged at the leader, tackling him mid-stride. The two crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, the energy blade skidding across the floor. The Xerian's strength was overwhelming, but Ryan fought with a ferocity born of desperation. "Valera," he shouted, struggling to keep the leader pinned. "Shut it down." Valera's hands trembled as she poured the last of her energy into the core. The rings slowed further, their rotation becoming erratic. Sparks flew from the pedestal, and the cavern filled with a deafening hum. The leader threw Ryan off with a roar, his eyes blazing with fury. He reached for his blade, but Ryan was faster. Grabbing the weapon, Ryan activated it, the energy humming against his grip. "Hey," Ryan called out, drawing the leader's attention. "Catch." With all his strength, Ryan hurled the blade. It struck the leader square in the chest, piercing his armor. The Xerian staggered, his eyes wide with shock before he collapsed to the ground. The core let out a high-pitched whine, its structure cracking under the strain. Valera fell to her knees, her body trembling. "It's destabilizing," she said weakly. "We need to leave. Now." Ryan rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. "Come on, princess. No time to nap." They stumbled toward the exit as the core began to implode, the air around it warping and distorting. The cavern shook violently, debris raining down from above. "Faster," Ryan shouted, half carrying Valera as they ran. The entrance loomed ahead, a faint light shining through the darkness. With one final push, they dove through the opening just as the core erupted in a blinding flash. The explosion sent a shockwave through the ruins, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Ryan and Valera lay sprawled on the ground, gasping for air. "We did it," Valera murmured, her voice barely audible. Ryan chuckled weakly, his body aching. "Yeah, we're alive. For now." The core was destroyed, but Ryan knew their fight wasn't over. The Xerian Empire would come for them, and the galaxy's balance was still precarious. But as he looked at Valera, a small smile tugged at his lips. They had survived the impossible, and together they would face whatever came next. The triumph. The glow of the erythium core's destruction still lingered in the air, a faint, unnatural shimmer that seemed to pulse with the weight of what had just happened. Ryan sat slumped against a jagged piece of rubble, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The faint hum of collapsing tunnels echoed in the distance, but the immediate danger had passed. Next to him, Valera lay motionless, her body battered and dimmed. Her once vivid glow had faded to the faintest flicker, and her breathing was shallow but steady. Ryan nudged her gently, his voice hoarse. "Hey, princess, don't you dare check out on me now." Her eyes fluttered open, a faint shimmer of light returning to them. "I am still here," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Though I feel like a star that has burned too bright." Ryan let out a weak laugh. "Well, you did just save the galaxy. I'd say that's a decent excuse to be tired." The faint sound of approaching footsteps snapped Ryan's attention back to the present. His instincts screamed danger, and he grabbed his rifle, though he wasn't sure how much good it would do with barely any ammunition left. The shadows at the edge of the rubble shifted, and for a moment Ryan's heart sank. But then he saw the figure, one of the Tsarian soldiers, staggering and bloodied, his weapon lowered. "I am not here to fight," the soldier rasped, raising a hand in what Ryan assumed was a universal gesture of surrender. His crimson armor was scorched, and his glowing eyes flickered weakly. "The core is destroyed. The Council's plans have failed." Ryan kept his rifle trained on the soldier, his finger hovering over the trigger. "You expect me to trust you after everything your people have pulled?" The soldier's gaze shifted to Valera, a flicker of something. Shame. Respect. Crossing his alien features. "She has proven herself. The Empire will not recover from this. The Council will fall." Ryan's grip on the rifle tightened, but Valera's weak voice broke the tension. "Let him speak," she whispered. "If he means to betray us, we are already too weak to stop him." Ryan glanced at her, then back at the soldier. With a reluctant sigh, he lowered his weapon slightly. "All right. Talk fast." The Xarian soldier stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I was loyal to the Empire," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "But the Council's greed destroyed everything we stood for. You, princess, have reminded us of who we were, who we could be again." Valera managed a faint smile, though her eyes were clouded with exhaustion. "Then there is hope." Ryan wasn't sure how much he trusted the soldier's words, but they didn't have time to debate. The tunnels were collapsing, and the distant sound of energy discharges suggested that not everyone was ready to surrender. Ryan helped Valera to her feet, her weight pressing heavily against him. "We need to get out of here," he said, glancing at the Xarian soldier. "If you're really on our side, help us find a way out." The soldier nodded, gesturing for them to follow. "There is a transport vehicle nearby. It should still be functional." Ryan and Valera followed the soldier through the crumbling ruins, their steps hurried and uneven. The ground trembled beneath them, and debris rained down from above. By the time they reached the transport, Ryan's legs felt like lead, and Valera was barely conscious. The vehicle was an alien craft, sleek and angular, with faint blue lights flickering along its sides. The soldier activated the controls, and the craft hummed to life, its hatch sliding open. "Get her inside," the soldier said, his voice urgent. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He carried Valera into the craft, carefully lowering her onto one of the seats. She let out a faint sigh, her head resting against the wall. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't thank me yet," Ryan replied, strapping her in as the craft began to lift off. As the transport ascended, the ruins of the Xarian facility disappeared beneath them. The landscape stretched out below, a wasteland of scorched earth and crumbling structures. Ryan stared out the window, his mind racing. They had destroyed the core, but at what cost? Would the Xarians regroup and come back stronger? Or had they dealt a crippling blow to the Empire's ambitions? Valera's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Ryan. He turned to her, his expression softening. Yeah. Her glowing eyes met his, a faint flicker of hope shining through her exhaustion. You saved me. Not just my life, but everything I stand for. My people may hate me, but perhaps in time, they will see. Ryan smiled faintly, leaning back against the seat. You're not so bad for an alien princess. I've worked with worse. She let out a weak laugh, the sound barely more than a breath. And you, human soldier, are far more than I expected. The transport landed in a remote clearing, far from the ruins. The Xarian soldier stepped out first, scanning the area. It is safe, he said, turning back to Ryan and Valera. I will return to my people. There is much to rebuild. Ryan helped Valera out of the craft, her steps unsteady but determined. She turned to the soldier, her expression resolute. If you truly believe in rebuilding, start by spreading the truth. The Council's lies must be exposed. The soldier nodded solemnly. You have my word. As the soldier disappeared into the horizon, Ryan and Valera stood alone in the clearing. The silence was heavy, but it was no longer oppressive. It was a silence filled with possibility. So, Ryan said, breaking the quiet. What's next? Galactic peace. A new empire. Valera smiled faintly, her gaze distant. First, we recover. Then, we see what remains of the galaxy. Together. Ryan nodded, his own exhaustion catching up with him. Together. As they walked into the unknown, the faint light of dawn broke across the horizon, casting the wasteland in hues of gold and orange. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like they had a chance, not just to survive, but to build something worth fighting for.